Hi. This is
Hello.
JD. Welcome to Adoptee Cuento Cuento, Filipino adoptees and our experiences told by us and for us. Today, we are talking to Maria. We have an awesome guest, a good friend of mine. We've been talking for quite a while. I'm very excited to have you here, Maria.
Hi, it's nice to see you again. It's exciting to be doing this, having this conversation with you. I think we've had some conversations in the past about, my experience as an adoptee, but I think it's going to be really helpful to share some of the things that I've experienced as an adoptee for others to relate to.
Awesome. Well, definitely am excited to hear your story and have you on. So, as an adoptee from the Philippines, and also you are from Canada. So, we have another North American, but not from the US. I'm really excited to kind of show where other adoptees are living around the world. So, Maria, give us a little bit of a background into kind of like where you live, what you're doing these days, and just a brief introduction.
So I'm from Toronto, Canada, and I was raised here since I was 9 years old. I'm married, have three children. The oldest is 13, the next one is 7, and the youngest is 6 years old. Two girls and one boy. Um, and I used to be a teacher. I used to teach primary grades, but now I'm just full-time homemaker, if that's what you want to call it. But I'm a stay-at-home mom, and on the side, I'm writing my memoir. So that's what I'm doing with my extra time when they're at school. And I actually live about 2.5 hours away from Toronto, so in a little bit smaller kind of town. It's a little bit quieter, slower pace. It's actually quite a change from growing up in the big city. But I like it. We've been here for about 2 years, and yeah, that's a little
Awesome.
bit about me.
Awesome. That's a nice crew you got there with all those little youngins.
It's very busy.
Awesome. Well, I'm very interested to hear about your adoption experiences as part of this Akosi series. It's really understanding and connecting to different experiences that adoptees have. So how did you find out about your adoptee story, as well as did you know about your adoption from the very beginning or when you found out?
So, um, I was adopted when I was 8 months old by my adoptive father. My adoptive father is he's gay, and so it was just him that adopted me. He didn't have a partner. He wasn't married, um, and he was also a lot older when he acquired me. He was already in his 40s when he acquired me. So, and then I spent maybe about 3 years with him, and he left for Canada because his parents were already citizens here in Canada. And then my grandfather passed away while he was visiting the Philippines. So when he passed away, they had to bring him back to Canada. And my dad and his siblings came to Canada for the funeral. And then what ended up happening was the majority of them, um, I guess, ended up becoming a resident here.
So
So
you
for
were a domestic adoptee in the Philippines, and then your adoptive
Yes,
father went to Canada, and but you guys had 3 years in the Philippines
yeah,
together.
yeah.
Okay.
Um, and I want to be clear when I say I was adopted at 18, because the real definition of being adopted is legally being adopted.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I want to be clear about this portion of how I was adopted, because I actually was not legally adopted. So I'm going to share a little bit about um, the things that I learned about. So I was born in the late 80s. And one of the times what would happen is if a mother wasn't able to care for her child, she would either give the child to somebody that she knew, or leave the child in front of an orphanage, or leave the child at the side of the road. This was very common in the Philippines because the Philippines is a third world country and the poverty is huge there. So the way that I was given to my dad was not in a legal, it wasn't processed legally. There was nobody from authorities that was involved, where today you would, but it's kind of like that, but they're a little bit higher in terms of title, and they deal with everything that has to do with the area that they're allowed to deal with. And they would come to this place, tell them, okay, I'm unable to care for my child, please help me do a process of maybe putting the child into an orphanage or something like that. And this would be documented, right? But back in the late 80s, this wasn't a thing. It wasn't public knowledge that if you wanted to give your child away, you had to do it the legal way, where that was the only way. And there wasn't that. So what happened was my dad was over at his friend's house, and this friend's house he was neighbors with my maternal aunt. And my mom she happened to go to my aunt's house, and I guess they had a conversation that I couldn't care for this child. There was a guy, my dad, who's suddenly looking for a child to care for, and then I was given to him without records saying that this child is being given to this person by this person, none of that. And
Did they do any type of, like, I don't want to say interview, but like, how did they qualify your adoptive
there's no
father?
such thing as if he qualifies, or my okay, so from what I've learned is my maternal aunt has essentially talked my mother into giving me up, because they weren't really financially um well off. My mother was, she lived in poverty, and she was living in Manila.
How
um
old was she? Do you know?
she was 27 when she had me, or just turning 27, so she was 26.
Okay.
um anyway, so I was in the Philippines um with my dad, my adoptive father, up until I was 3 years old. Um, so the thing is, my mother gave me to him. He took me back to his hometown in Manila, in Tondo, where his family home was. And then that was that. Um, at 3, he left to come to Canada, and then he never came back. And then it would be 6 years later that I would eventually come to Canada, but he left me with his sister-in-law. Um, who also had children. I think there was like 4 of them at the time, and I had no idea like what was happening. I was 3 years old. I can't remember anything from like before I was with my aunt in the Philippines. Right? I was 3 years old. Like, what do you remember really? Um, I don't remember much before I went to my aunt's. But what I do remember is like how it was living with my aunt, and like that experience, and how almost like a disattachment to it, because I don't know, it didn't feel like I understood what was happening, or like if I was supposed to permanently be there, or like it was almost like at any given time I was going to go somewhere else, or like somebody was going to take me, or I didn't understand family. Like I didn't know who they were. I didn't understand how I was related to them. Um,
Did they not talk about any of this while you're, 5,
No,
6, 7?
they just told me that my dad is in Canada and he would call every so often and I would talk to him and like I just remember being really mean to him on the phone. And back then, what you would do is when you had a parent that was like, oh, in abroad, um, you would send cassette tapes of recordings of you. I don't know if people did this, but I did this. And I remember like my aunt would like pull me out of playing just to like monthly make this cassette tape recording of me just talking. And she would send this to my dad. I don't really know what was the purpose of that, but it's funny because when I came here, the day that I landed, the day that we came home to my dad's house, he made me listen to one of those, and I was the meanest child.
Oh, oh my
I was just
goodness.
like, I don't even know why I'm making this recording. I don't know who you are. Like, I don't know why I'm having to stop playing. Like, I've never even seen you. I don't know why I have to do this. Like, I was just, I guess it just
Wow.
was really clear how confused I was as a child, having a parent that I've never seen before, but I was told was in Canada. And like I didn't even understand my position in the household that I was living in. So it was that much more confusing that I was having to do these little things like be on the phone when he would call, like who am I talking to? And yeah, so I didn't learn I was adopted. They say ampon, but ampon, it's kind of like a neutral term that they use for anything that has to do with like another person from outside of this household or outside of this, I guess, like family coming in and living with them. It could be a dog. They could say the same thing about a dog that this dog is ampon because they just took the dog in kind of thing. So I didn't understand what this term meant because I don't think I knew what adopted was. I don't I You would never think to figure out what adopted is because one, you're Filipino, so growing up in the Philippines, adopted is not the word they use. But I also didn't understand what ampon meant. I connected it with, okay, so my aunt said that I have a dad in Canada, so that means that I'm not part of this family, so they call me ampon.
So they did say that to you or
Yeah.
call you that. Okay.
Yeah, but my understanding is it's just because they're not my circle of family. My dad, right, is in Canada, but it didn't make sense to me that I wasn't blood related when they would use that term.
Got it. Okay. Got it. Yes.
Okay, so they would call me that, and like my older cousins would say, like, my mom is not your mom, stop calling her mom, because for a time I thought she was my mom. Mother figure that everybody called mom, I thought that I was her daughter too, because if my dad was in Canada and she's here, then that means she's my mom, right? And it didn't make sense to me. But then they would be like, no, she's not your mom. You're ampon, and your dad is in Canada,
And
and I'm
no
just,
one's explaining to you anything. So it's kind of
no,
like,
nobody's explaining it to you because they don't understand that in your little brain, your 3-year-old little brain, it doesn't make any sense. And then,
right.
like my cousins would, it would feel like we were siblings because I was the baby. And then, they were all much older than me. And, like they would be the babysitters if my aunt would be gone. Obviously, it felt like we were like a family, like they were my siblings and she was my mom. But no, there was many moments where it felt they were very clear to tell me like, no, you are not part of this circle of family and you are from somebody else kind of thing. Um,
Did you
so
have
when
a moment where you did maybe finally understand or connect to, okay, not just somebody telling you that you're adopted, but now you're understanding, okay, this is I am adopted. Did you have that moment?
I did. So when I was 9, I came to Canada. I got off the plane. Actually, I came on the plane by myself. My dad had gotten at the time they're called stewardess, right? So I remember being so confused because the plane just wouldn't land. Like it was such a long, like I didn't even know why I ended up on the airplane. I didn't know I was leaving the Philippines. Like I didn't understand
Wow.
what was happening. My cousin was just like, okay, we're gonna go to the airport and here's your backpack. And I thought like, oh, I'm just gonna go on a short trip to like, whatever. And then I'm gonna come back home because I had never left the Philippines before. And then I got on a plane and the plane wouldn't stop. And I was just like, why am I still up in the sky? And I don't know where I'm going. They just put me on a plane and like it was so scary that I cried for like the majority of the flight.
Hmm.
I couldn't sleep. And I just remember the lady beside me comforting me because I was like panicking because every time I opened the window, it was either day or night. And like it was just clouds. And I was so confused. Like, where am I going? Very long. Imagine like a 9-year-old by herself with no family on a plane, and you're just like, is this supposed to land? Where is it supposed to land? And who's supposed to take me that I know from where I'm going to land? And I remember, I think the plane had like a stopover and I almost got lost because I got off the plane and I didn't know that they were just refueling or something. And I had walked off and like I just remember hearing my name in the entire airport and they're just like, you have to come back or like the security has to find her because like I was so I was so lost. I don't remember where we got off, but I just remember like walking off out of the plane and then I was like, where am I supposed to go? So I just started walking and then some security guard from the airport found me and then took me back to the plane and I was like, why did we get off? Just so I could go back on. Like I thought I was like supposed to get off and then that's it, right? No, apparently there was like a whole other stretch of flying to get to Canada. And then I got here. I remember going to the baggage area and I see like just outside of these windows. Hey, so I saw one of my cousins and I'm like, okay, I know her. So she's like, hi, like she's waving. And I'm like, okay, so it's okay. We're safe. Like I'm where I'm supposed to be now. And then I remember her taking me out and I met my dad for the first time. And then like he hugged me. And the first thing that I said to him was, why are you touching me? I don't know who you are. And he was just like, oh, I'm your dad. And I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, but like I don't like people touching me. Don't touch me. And he was like, oh, okay. He goes, you don't remember my face? Because he had sent like these pictures in a frame. And I'm just like, you don't even look like that person, like it's so
That's
old.
like 6 years later, right? Since the last
Yeah.
time you saw him.
And like you don't remember anything at like 3 years old. So you're just like, I don't know who you are, but okay, you're like, you're my dad. So here I am at the airport, in the parking lot of the airport. We're walking to the car and I'm going like, where's my mother? Like I'm waiting for my mother to show up and be like, where's my mother? But I wasn't asking the questions because, it was my cousin, it was him, my dad, and then his sister, so my aunt. And there was just a bunch of people that you're just like, do they know something that I don't know? Maybe I should just wait, right? So I didn't say anything. And I just remember like going home and like my mother wasn't there. Like, when is my mother going to show up? Kind of thing.
Wow.
And so then it was kind of like maybe my mom and him separated and she lives elsewhere and like maybe I'll see her tomorrow. Because I was so used to like sort of being detached from my parents that I didn't know how it works. I don't understand what your parents are supposed to do, or like how, like, were they together? Were they not? But then I also noticed like my dad wasn't very manly. So then I was confused because then I was just like, okay, like there was kind of like gossip in the Philippines from the neighbors, and they would say things like your dad is a ballerina, or like your mother is a drug addict, like a bunch of things they would just say. So then you don't know what to believe, right? So like I'm meeting this man for the very first time where I can consciously remember who he is, and he's a little off for some reason. I don't know where my mother is, but we're home now. And then my dad had a bunch of like stuffed toys, like just toys that were like toys that you would get maybe when you're a toddler that he's accumulated. And I'm just like, I don't play with these things. And he's just like, oh, I didn't want to send them to you in the Philippines because I didn't want you to leave it there. And so I ended up growing up like not really playing with toys. And I like, okay. And it was just like very childish things, like he bought like one of those like Mickey Mouse couches, those soft couches, like for little toddlers. I was 9 years old. Like, I mean, I fit in it, but it just like squash when you sit on it. And then um yeah, like the first thing he did was like play one of the recordings that I sent him as a child, like as a young child. And then I was just like, ew, like, and then it was embarrassing because I was so mean in the cassette tape that I was just like, I'm sorry, like I didn't know what I was saying at the time, obviously. Um, and then it wouldn't be until like maybe a few weeks or so settling in that I would go to one of his sister's house who doesn't have children, and I would spend maybe like I think either a weekend with them, and that's the day when I found out I was adopted. So I woke up. It was like, it was October 1997. So I don't know when that was, but it was just like not too long after I came here, and it was winter. I woke up and it was cold. Like, you're trying to get used to the climate here because the Philippines is just hot. You come here, and even if you're inside the house where it has heating, you don't know that feeling of like it's so cold. It like, pierces through your skin into your bones. Like that's the kind of cold I felt. And I remember waking up going, oh, like, why is it so cold? And then I ran down the stairs, and I remember like, being 9 years old and hopping from the stairs to like the kitchen, and I peek through and I see my aunt like half in the fridge and my uncle sitting at the table having his coffee, and they're like, good morning, like, did you sleep well? And I'm like, yeah, like it's just really cold. So like my uncle gets me socks, and like totally normal, right? Because you're related, or so you thought. And I'm sitting there, and I remember like having a bagel for the very first time because I didn't know bread had holes in the middle. I thought it was a donut, but it wasn't. um and then she offered me like this salmon cream cheese, and I remember it so clearly because I was just like, what is this? Like in the picture, in the picture of the tub, it's got salmon. I've never eaten salmon before, and I was expecting when you open the lid that it would look like that, but it was this mushy thing. And then she put it on the bagel, and I was like, it smells bad, And she's like, it's good. You should try it. And I was like, this is what you eat here. And they're just like, yeah. So like mushy fish on bread. And they're like, yeah, it's cheese. It's not mushy fish. And I'm like, okay. I didn't like it, to say the least, at the time. I was a very picky eater. So we're sitting and, just chit chatting. And my aunt asked, like, how was it growing up in the Philippines with your cousins? How was, how did your cousins treat you? How was your aunt? And um, my aunt that I was speaking to had never met me. Because I think at the time when my dad had me or brought me home, they had already been here in Canada. So they never met me until I came here. So then, we're having a conversation and I'm telling them things about, like, my cousins, how they would tease me. And it's very quiet, as a child. Um, so we're just having that conversation. And then she goes, so you know that you're adopted, right? And I said, what does that mean? She goes, well, your dad's not your dad.
Is this all in English or Tagalog?
In Tagalog.
Okay.
Which sounds harsher, by the way. And I was like, what is that? What does that mean?
What's the Tagalog word for adopted?
She
Aside
used
from
the same
ampon.
term, ampon.
Okay.
So she goes, you know that you're ampon, right?
Okay.
And then I said, I don't know. I don't really know what that means. Like, not anymore because I'm with my dad now, And they're
Right.
just like, no, like, he's not your dad. And I was like, what? What do you mean he's not my dad? And I'm like, well, he's gay, like, he can't have you. And then I said, he's gay. Okay. Like, he's gay after, like, I didn't understand any of it. So I'm just like, he's gay afterwards. Like, after he had me, he decided to be gay, He goes, no, he's gay. Like, he and your mom, they don't know each other. So the minute that she said that, I felt like I sank into the chair and I was like so shocked because here I am. I'm still waiting for my mom to show up. And she told me, like, she and my dad don't know each other. So I'm like, so where is my mom? And who is this guy? And why am I here? Like, who are you people? Like, all of a sudden there was this, like, 1,000 questions in my little 9-year-old brain, like, trying to process what she just said to me. And then, like, my uncle goes, don't say anything to her because you don't know what she doesn't know yet. And, like, you don't know if, like, her dad said anything to her yet. Like, why are you telling her this? And she's just like, oh, be quiet, like, she already knows. Well, she assumed I should already know, right? Because, well, I grew up without my dad. And, like, I don't think she knew what I didn't know. So she blurted it out because we're having a conversation. And she goes, yeah, your dad's not your dad. He's gay. He can't have you. And I'm like, oh. And I think just, like, everything after that, I don't remember. Because I just remember sitting there thinking, like, do I call my dad and, like, yell at him and tell him, like, bring me back to to where I'm from? Like, who are you? Why are you people lying to me? Like, I didn't understand how to react, that there was no reaction. And later down the line, years later, as an adult, my aunt would be like, you really handled finding out being adopted really well. And I was like, you mean, like, handling it in the best possible way at 9 years old? Because I didn't understand any of it. And she's like, yeah, because, I know this other person that's adopted, and she, like, freaked out when she found out. She ran away. The cops had to find her. And, like, it was just this whole, like, comparison. And, like, I didn't grow up with another adopted person in the family. I did, you know what I mean? So, like, I didn't understand any of it. And then she was just like, yeah, you took it so well. And I was just like, and up until that point, like, I had never talked about that moment. And the thing that was probably the most terrible part of all of it, aside from finding out that moment that I wasn't related to my dad or her, was that my dad, even after finding out that my aunt told me, never brought it up with me or talked about it. Didn't talk to me about like, how are you feeling now that you know? Did you know? Um, this is what happened, how I got you. Like, I was so scared
So you
after
were
I
just
found out.
left alone to just wonder, ponder, no
Yeah,
guidance, no talk.
like I remember the end of that day at night, I was crying because I felt like I had to run away and go back to like the Philippines because I felt like they kidnapped me, like who are these people? I don't know who they are. And like I remember not knowing how to use the telephone here or like how to call my aunt that I grew up with. And like she was the closest to anything safe that I remember. So but like I didn't know how to contact her. I didn't see her at the airport. I didn't know how to call her. I was so scared. And like I remember trying to sleep that night. I slept crying, like, until I fell asleep because I didn't know what was happening and nobody was explaining any of it to me. Um, and then I would go home to my dad and my dad would never say anything about it.
So how
And
did this affect you? Right at 9, you found out. How did this affect you through the rest of your childhood into your teenage years?
so like as a child in the Philippines, I was like like a shithead. Like I caused problems. I fought with everybody at school. I was the biggest tomboy and I had like a boyish personality, so I played with mostly boys, but I would get into fights with everybody and I felt like I was always trying to survive as a child in the Philippines because I these weren't my family that I was living with. So it felt like I was very alone and I had to survive until I would come and meet my dad and go to my dad. And then when I was growing up here, it was the same thing. It was the culture shock, the environment. It's like the environment changed. Um, I had to speak English. I already spoke a little bit of English because we learn it in the Philippines. Um, it was I just remember feeling very confused throughout my childhood after I moved here. Um, and there was this irritating feeling of not feeling like you were supposed to be here, like you belong here, like you're with the people you're supposed to be with, There's this disconnect that you feel as a child because one, you just found out you're not really related to them. So you're just like, what happened to my family? And why isn't anybody talking about it? And why isn't anybody explaining to me when I'm going home? Or why I'm with these people? How did I become with these people? Like, where's my mother? Where's my dad? Like, what does this all mean? And I just remember being too scared to ask questions because I don't want to hurt his feelings. Um, and it almost felt like he was playing house. You know what I mean? Like, he's my dad, but he wasn't very manly. So is he my mom? Like, it was just, it's different growing up with a parent who isn't a man because you're looking for that manly sort of caregiver, but he wasn't. And then you're not used to it. You don't understand what that means. You don't understand what gay means. Like, what does it mean when you're 9 years old? You don't know. You just know that okay, he feels like a girl, or and then it just you learn to adapt. That's what I did. I adapted to the environment that I was living in. I adapted to the idea of family within the construct that I had, and then I adapted to essentially bury all of the things that I was feeling because one, I couldn't explain it. Two, I didn't understand it. I had no language for it. I didn't know what my family was thinking about, so I couldn't ask the right questions. And I would spend so many moments after that just wondering, like, why did my mom give me away, or like why did she disappear, or like who said I could come to Canada, like who allowed it, how did he do that, how did he say Like, how do you not be somebody's child anymore and be somebody else's?
Do you feel like that you changed once you kind of found out, especially as you grow up and you start to maybe understand just a little bit more about life? Do you feel like you changed?
I feel like I changed in a sense where a lot of the things that I was feeling made sense from like being in the Philippines to moving here. So like that disconnect from the family that you feel, you're just like, why is it like that? Or like, why don't people understand me? Or why don't I look like any of them? It all made sense after I found out that I was adopted. Because then I was just like, oh,
Yes.
well, I guess that's what happens when you're not actually from this family. You don't look like them, you don't act like them, you don't move like them, you don't sound like them. Like it's different. You're different. And it would also be reinforced in the way that they were around me, right? So like sometimes my cousins would all go out and I wasn't allowed to come with them. Um, I don't know. There would be like family gatherings sometimes. So like there's an example where we went to a Pizza Hut with a couple of my aunts and my uncle and my cousins, and my dad wasn't present, but I was there. And I remember my uncle going at the end of the dinner, so who's paying for her? And you know, as a child, you think, well, you're just like your cousins, right? They pay the adults pay for you. And that's when they reinforce you are not part of this family. You are somebody else. You don't belong in this family. And then you're just like, why is that? You know, I don't even know how I got here. So, you know, it's little things like that that would happen and you would be reminded like, okay, you don't belong here. You're not part of this family. Um, and other terrible things happened that, you know, people who weren't adopted would probably never experience. You know what I mean? So I've been accused of like having sexual relations with like a cousin of mine that was a boy because, you know, they would say things like it's possible when you're not related to have a situation like that happen. And for me as a child, you'd think like, but I grew up knowing that these are my cousins. They're kind of like my siblings at this point. That would never cross my mind. But they would put it into your head. So then you're just like, is that like a thing? You know, is that really possible? And you're too young to even understand what that means. Like I didn't know anything about intimacy and all that stuff until like well after high school. So for them to talk about it at such a young age because I was adopted and it was a possible thing, um, it changes you.
With
It
all
changes you.
these things that you're going through, the emotions, the frustrations, right? How did you process all of this? How do like that's a lot to deal with as a kid, as an adult, as a teenager. How did you process this? Did you do I mean, were you just a angry kid or do you just avoid it? Was there
I
anything that
think
you
it
did
was a
do?
mixture of things. So I've always sort of done writing. You
Okay.
know, I've had a lot of journals and like diaries with locks on them. You know, I've always written things down. That was, I think, maybe I didn't know at the time, but one way that I was processing things is by writing them down and just like trying to understand what was happening in that moment. The other thing is, well, you know, I was a very aggressive child. Aggressive as in, you know, my mouth was had no filter. I said what I thought. I said what I felt. Whether you were an adult or a child, you know, you weren't spared from that. Um, I was, you know, a shithead. Like I fought with everybody and anybody. Nobody was allowed to like hurt me. Nobody was allowed to bully me. And I was bullied as a child because I was short. And that meant like, you know, all of the Caucasian classmates that I had growing up, because I grew up in a European area in Toronto. Um, would make fun of me for being short. And that meant that I would push people around, and I would, join all the sports and make sure that I did really well, because I didn't want to be deemed as incapable because I was short. Like, I was bullied for being Filipino, sometimes because it was that you're too dark, right? You're so dark, you're so short.
Mhm.
And when I first started going to school here, I also had one of those luggage bags. It was very common in the Philippines to have a luggage bag. And if you had a luggage bag, it meant that you were like rich and you were like capable, because those bags had the straps for it to be a backpack, but it also had wheels, because we actually took all our books home when we went to school. We never left any of our books at school. We took them home because we actually had to study every single day. And so I had this bag from the Philippines, and I thought, oh, I'm so cool. I had this bag. Everybody had, not everybody has this bag in the Philippines. But then I was the only one that had this bag in Canada, or at least in my school. And they made fun of me. They were just like, where are you going? Like, are you traveling? Why do you have like a luggage with you? But it wasn't a luggage. Like, when you actually open the bag, there are like pockets for your books and stuff like that. Like, it was a backpack, right? But it was little things like that where you're just like, oh, like, it's so different here. um but like, a lot of it, I don't think I processed in the right way. I just was I think I got even more aggressive after I found out that I was adopted. And then, but it was only towards other people. It was never to my family. To my family, I was very obedient, quiet, um nothing. I only talk when I was spoken to, never shared what I thought. um
Why is that? Is that just because maybe that's what your father was also simulating, was just not talking? And
No, I think I was just super quiet as a kid because I didn't know what was going on half the time. And I didn't know how to be. I didn't know, I just didn't understand any of it. So I was just quiet in my family because I didn't know what I was supposed to say or how I was supposed to talk or who I was supposed to be. When I came here, my dad tried to change everything about me. I was super boyish, climbed trees, ran around with the boys, got dirty growing up in the Philippines. Here, my dad wanted me to wear skirts, you know, from learning how to use utensils to how to sit. My dad tried to like teach me how to be a girl in every possible way. The way that I laughed, he didn't like it. He said, don't laugh like that, laugh like this. You're not allowed to wear clothes, you're not allowed to wear jeans that are ripped up and shirts that have holes. Um, and I had this skateboard growing up that I made in the Philippines from scratch. It wasn't a real skateboard that you would see today. It was literally just two plaques of wood that I found on the side of the road and some computer chair wheels that I had connected onto it. And it didn't really go forward or backwards or anywhere. I would hold on to the back of the Jeepney and it would pull me. That's it. That was my skateboard, but I love that thing because I made it. And before I left, I had all of my friends sign my board. And I understood that when I came here, I no longer could be that person because my dad burned it. My
I
dad
find that
burned it.
ironic that your father has a certain right. He is, um, as you say, he's a little bit more feminine, but yet he tried to change everything about you,
Yeah,
right? I find that interesting dynamic.
yeah. I wasn't allowed to be whoever I was back in the Philippines. And he would say things like, it's not like they would say things to me like, you're not in the Philippines anymore. You're here now and it's different here. You can't do the things that you used to do over there. It's because it's not like that here. So, like in the Philippines, you have that certain freedom where at the end of the day, after school, the children will just play outside all day until it's nighttime. And all of the kids will run around outside playing whatever, climbing whatever, and that's okay. Like your parents didn't have to be outside trying to like micromanage you. You just played, and they knew, and you knew when to come home. But here, it wasn't like that. Children wasn't always all over the, like, the streets. Um, and it was just different. I couldn't make friends at first because I was very, one, kind of like a jungle, like they called me jungle kid. Like they just called me a jungle kid. I wasn't ashamed of it because I was, like I'm from an island. Um, but I didn't understand that they were making fun of me for it. Right. So it took a while before I made friends. Um, and I was also very dominant in personality. So that was also a problem with other children. And so I think like just right from the get-go, my dad was trying to say, okay, listen, we're together now. I'm in charge. This is not who you are. You are who I say you are. And that is your position in the family. For everybody, for you to live this idea that we have of you, because I own you. And all throughout that time, you're still wondering, how did you own me? How did you get to owning me? Why do you own me? I don't know who you are. And my dad and I never had a relationship that was cohesive in any way or like nurturing in any way. It was always like two people in the dark who were blind trying to find their way to get to each other. Like I felt like that's what it was. Maybe one chasing after the other more than the other. Like I was always trying for him to accept me, for him to love me, for him to see who I was. I was waiting for that moment for him to like understand who I was in front of him because he sees me every day. But it never happened and I didn't understand why. I was always trying to like make him gifts, buy him gifts, and like make pictures like, that says I love you. And I didn't even know what that meant. But I just knew that I was trying to pull something out of him that maybe you're not supposed to, because it's supposed to be natural, right? Um, so it was a lot of that. And then obviously our relationship would get worse over time because I would get older, I would have my own thoughts, I would become sort of more aware of the whole thing. And I would experience, depression and anxiety, and I wouldn't really know that that's what it was. And like I'm 34 this year, and in the 34 years that I've been alive, 7 years of that I was with my dad. But in those 7 years, I spent with extended relatives and his friends. So if you really think about it, as a parent, you're supposed to, from 0 to 18 at the most, at the least, I should say, you'd be with your parents. But I was only with my dad for 7 years. And in that 7 years, I spent most of the time with extended relatives and his friends. And that meant like 2 months of summer after school here. He would leave me for 2 months with a friend. Or every day after school, for the whole entire week, other than the weekend, I would be at my aunt's house and she would watch me during the 5 days, and then I would go home for the weekend. It was very minimal, the amount of time that we spent. And so it didn't make sense. Like, why did you bring me here? Why did I have to be here if you didn't actually want to take care of me? So I spent a lot of time just internalizing all of it and not actually processing it in a healthy way, because there was nobody I could have a conversation about this with that understood what I was feeling or what I was thinking, or somebody that could explain to me yeah, like how you're feeling is valid. It's, you know, like nobody acknowledged it. Nobody validated how I was feeling because they just thought like, oh yeah, I found out and I took it so well.
Did that lead to anything because you couldn't talk about it and you didn't even maybe have a way to express it? Did that lead to anything because you weren't
The
doing
first
it?
time, the first time that I touched a cigarette, I was 12 years old. I found a pack of cigarettes somebody had dropped by the library. And I went to the back of the library and I smoked a cigarette. And I got caught by the librarian. um, and then ever since then, I've been smoking cigarettes up until, you know, I had children. Um, and then the first time that I drank, I was like 13 years old. And behind my dad's back, you know, I started drinking. And that also meant throughout high school, I was borderline alcoholic and a smoker for the last several years. Um, and that included marijuana. Like I got into marijuana at a very young age. Because there was a certain feeling that you got where it numbed the things that you were feeling or the things that were just sitting on the surface that you had no idea what to do about. And when you were on some sort of, you know, you're intoxicated by something, you know, cigarettes help you calm down. It helps you. It doesn't. It's just your. It's in your brain, right? In your brain, it helps you calm down. It helps you um, process through things. It doesn't. It's just it's just in your head. When you drink, it changes you in a sense. You get tipsy and you're no longer thinking so hard about everything, right? And then you mix that with marijuana. Well, you're good. You're feeling great. You're not feeling any pain. You're having a great time. You're somebody else other than that person who's constantly sad, who's constantly depressed, who's constantly anxious. You're just great. So then I relied on that all throughout high school. Um, and that would get me in a lot of trouble because my dad was like, you know, I don't understand why you're doing all the bad things. Like, you know, we've never fell short in trying to share wisdom with you and you know, whatever. Like it's bullshit. Because my dad wasn't actually the main caregiver for me. It was his sisters. You know, if I got in trouble with my dad, all of my aunts would come to my house and they'd put me in a chair and they'd circle around me and they'd all take turns yelling at me and, you know, doing a sermon for like 3 hours about how terrible of a person I was. Um, and that could be for like the simplest things like going out to your friend's house to like not getting home on time from school. It was like there was nothing that you were spared from growing up in my family. Um, it wasn't like that for my cousins because I had parents.
So
But
they don't tell you anything, they don't share with you, they don't even get you help,
no,
therapy, nothing. But then
but they
they don't
punish
even
me for
tell you how
everything.
to deal with this, but then you're in trouble for everything.
Yeah, that's how I grew up. And that changes you. It changes who you are. It changes your brain. It changes how you see the world, how you know, how you interact with others. It changes the way that you understand relationships, socializing, how you develop as a person. You know, it changes everything, and it changes whoever the heck you were before. You know, like whoever you were when you were born. The minute that you are given away, that person is no longer there. You become somebody else, whether you're an infant or you're, you know, 6 years old when you're adopted.
Yeah.
I feel like at 8 months old, I became somebody else. And then up until I was 3, I became someone else after that because I had to live with my aunt. And then for those 6 years, I was someone else. And then I had to move here and then I became someone else. And I was just constantly everything else but who I was supposed to be. And that's called adaptation. Like you are adapting to every single thing that comes your way. And you were never just one person. You were never just who you're supposed to be. You're just everything and everyone in all of those moments, whoever you happen to be. And you had to be really good at it if you wanted to survive.
I
Because
agree.
I don't know, as a child, I don't know how anybody's supposed to, like, I think about it if it was my children, like how my children would process through like something like what I went through, and I bawl my eyes out. Like I cry because I couldn't imagine them going through it, and I couldn't imagine what it was like to be that child. And and you had to just do everything to numb it. So I just did all the bad things. And then I ended up in foster care because my mental health decreased and got worse as I got older and I went into high school. Like, like you're dealing with other things in high school, like trying to fit in, just trying to be a teenager was hard. But then trying to be an adopted teenager, trying to manage home and your social life, it was a lot. I was hated by the girls in my school. I was bullied, and I was hated for the simplest thing, like being friends with all the boys they liked, you know, um, to having a personality where I don't give a shit about things half the time. I was hated for like the littlest thing at school. And then I was the same thing at home. I was disliked for whoever that person was.
So did you go to foster care in high school?
I did. So what happened was, with all of the, trauma and the depression and anxiety that I was going through that I didn't understand, I actually experienced suicidal ideation. So there was a lot of times where I wanted to just end my life. Um, I was tired of fighting with my dad. I was tired of like just being stressed out all the time. Um, I was an honor student all throughout all of it. And I guess the decline happened, and it was hard for the principal and my teachers to not notice. So what happened was the decline happened at school. I was skipping more. My grades were kind of going down. And, when you're somebody who's well known to be an honor student in the school, who the teachers know personally in terms of like academics, you excel, and then it flatlines in a sense, they're going to say something to you. So I remember one morning being sent to um, my guidance counselor's office to talk about my grades. Um, but prior to that, the night before, I had written a suicidal letter because I was just at the end of my wits and I was just tired of everything. And I was like, okay, like I'm over it. And I remember putting the letter in my locker. Um, I don't know how the school got it. Obviously, they went into my locker. And then I thought I was going to the guidance counselor's office to talk about my grades and like skipping classes, right? I was forging letters for the office to get out of school. Um, and then the guidance counselor was actually there with a social worker because they had found my letter in my locker. I don't know if it dropped from my locker or something, but they had gotten a hand of it. And then it went from there. The social worker visited my house. She saw that my dad and I were living in a 1-bedroom apartment, more like a bachelor apartment. The living room wasn't used as a living room. It was just it held all of the things that my dad hoarded. There was no living room. We literally had a tiny kitchen and one bedroom. We shared a room. And the social worker was like, Mr. Blah, 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 like you need to have space for her because she's, a growing girl. She's a teenager and she needs privacy. And that was the first part I remember before I ended up in foster care, that the social worker gave my dad the opportunity to move to see maybe if the situation would change. But he didn't. He said, like, yeah, no, I'm not doing that. And the social worker had no choice but to take me. And I ended up living with an Italian family for about a year and a half. Um, and 45 minutes to an hour away from my dad. And that was weird because you think that you were adopted and that was that. And then you end up in foster care and it's like you're being rehomed all over again. Like you're being moved again. You don't belong anywhere, but everybody's just gonna pass you around until it all makes sense for everybody else. And it was a year and a half of living with somebody else I didn't know. I was a good kid, like the foster mom that I had loved me. She was like, you have been the most pleasant kid that I've ever gotten. But the entire time I was in turmoil. Like I cried every night. I didn't understand why I was there. I didn't understand why I couldn't go home, whatever that meant, at least going home to my dad. It felt like I was in trouble. I would talk to my dad. I would call him and he would blame me for what happened. And just before foster care, I ended up in the mental ward in the hospital for the suicidal letter. They had to put me in the hospital. And I was in the hospital for 10 days. And my dad visited me once or twice and said, you know what, you're in here because it was your fault. And like, you're just going to have to wait until you're allowed to come out. And he visited me once or twice, and that was that. And I was in high school at the time before I was even 15. And then I turned 16 while I was in foster care. And the social worker said, okay, so you're going to go back to your dad's because you're technically of age to make these decisions, or are you going to live on your own, or what did you want to do? And I guess it was that moment when I felt like I didn't want to go back to any of it. It was like me going into foster care was a way for me to leave all of it. And then I decided I wanted the social worker to write up the paper, the document to get me emancipated from my dad's care.